welcome to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. We have a great show for you today. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is the last day of May, May 31st, and we are going to cover today, we're going to get into a little bit of the SEC spring meetings, a ton of just kind of grab bag kind of news that came out of there that I definitely want to cover with you all, especially some stuff around Florida State and Clemson that is very, very interesting. Then we'll get into a little bit of a debate that's going around right now. What is good enough to get into the playoff this year? Is it 9-3? Is it 10-2? Is it 8-4 for some teams? So we'll find out what that looks like. Then we have a new thing that might be coming to college football, which is sponsorships on the field, on jerseys possibly. So definitely something that is a little bit of a double-edged sword when you look at the future of college football. Then we have a couple of rescheduling things, a couple of big-time rivalries have been moved days, have been moved times, so definitely want to break down all of that for you guys, and then we'll get into what we usually do to end out the week, a little update on what college football 25 is looking like. Today is the day that we get tons of gameplay and more in-depth view of what the game is going to look like, but for the time being, we just have to speculate just a little bit longer. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have a fun back and forth here, is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of the screen, gsmcpodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to have kind of a fun, interactive experience here, and I think that's always fun for the both of us. But let's jump right in, and let's talk about the SEC spring meetings. There was tons of stuff coming out of Destin this week, and it was really hard to keep track of it all. You know, there are tons of coaches speaking on different issues, the Jaden Rashada case, the House settlement, the allocation for the House settlement, possible realignment. All of this stuff was discussed. So I kind of want to get into what was going on during this week at Destin and kind of go a little bit rapid fire. Then throughout probably next week, we'll get a little bit deeper into these topics as we go. But one of the big things that did happen while we were there, Brett McMurphy, one of the big-time reporters in college football, was on the Paul Feinbaum show and said the SEC has no interest in adding Clemson or Florida State. It sounds like Florida State very much wants in on the SEC, but that doesn't sound like something that is going to come to fruition for them, at least not as of right now. Florida also weighed in on this. They said there's really nothing that they can do individually to stop Florida State from joining the league. It requires a 3/4 majority, and as we all saw only a couple of years ago, A&M didn't want Texas in, and that didn't necessarily work out because a lot of other teams did. So it could be that, you know, this shifts over time, but it is very interesting with the SEC not necessarily being as interested in Florida State as you would think. So that's going to be a huge topic of conversation. I think when you look at Florida State right now, they're going to get out of the ACC. They're pushing as hard as they can. They're making as many arguments as they can to find their way out of that conference. Now, the bigger question is, once you get past that, is where are you going to go? Because I know there have been a lot of conference realignment in the past, but for the most part, a lot of those were calculated decisions. There were a couple, you know, Utah, which we'll talk about actually a little bit later in here, is one of the only few that did it without any landing point actually in place, or at least not the one that they wanted, I guess is probably the better way to put that. So Florida State is in a situation where you want to be in the SEC. Let's just say, for argument's sake, they absolutely do not want you and you're not going to get into the SEC. You could look up at the Big Ten, but they have a very strict requirement school, which is essentially a research level type school. It's a certain distinction among academics. You usually don't get a look from the Big Ten. Now, Nebraska is not an AAU school, but they were when they joined the league back in 2010, 2011, I think. So definitely a little bit of a different circumstance now, but Florida State is one of those interesting situations where I'm not necessarily super surprised that people are not super interested in them, especially the SEC. I felt like a lot of last year, especially when the playoff came out and all of that stuff was kind of the fallout of all of that stuff was happening, they were going after the SEC. They were saying that it's unfair that they get all this preferential treatment, that Alabama didn't deserve to be in. And if you're going to attack Alabama, you're attacking the SEC. And it doesn't necessarily surprise me that the people up top at the SEC are not necessarily too keen on adding Florida State. And that begs the question of, where do you end up? If the AAU moniker is so important to the Big Ten, if you really cannot get into the SEC, you might just have to go to the Big 12 and kind of figure it out from there, which is not the ideal situation by any means. And it goes to show you, just like the portal, as we've talked about a number of times, the grass isn't always greener on the other side. Definitely do not, jump into these discussions without much of a plan going forward. So it'll be very interesting. I think the Big 12 could be the big beneficiary of this, but it definitely will be a fascinating thing to watch. Another big thing that happened throughout this week was the talk around the House settlement and the $20 million in particular, and how are you going to divide that up? No one really knows if it's going to be a 50-50 split between men's and women's, or they're going to allocate it to football mostly and then kind of divide the remainder of whatever it looks like from there. So that's a big problem. And as we talked about for a lot of this week, really, is throughout June is one of the most important recruiting times in the entire country. There are tons of big time schedules set for this weekend, for the following weekend, for pretty much every weekend in June. And kids are going to want to know this answer, whether it's, them wanting a certain amount of money or it's them just wanting clarity on what the future of this sport looks like. They're going to want answers to how much is the football team getting? How much are individual players getting? Is it different for freshman to senior? Is it different for playing time versus non-playing time? All of this stuff has to be figured out. And it sounds like none of the coaches really have an idea. And that's going to be a very weird conversation to have with a lot of recruits. But it's definitely one of those things that they're going to have to figure out really quickly. Because you can't necessarily let this thing go too long without knowing where all this money's going. Because then you can kind of adapt to the new circumstances of the college sports. And hopefully, if it is all going to football or if it is all going to the revenue-making sports, then you have to figure out ways to supplement that in the smaller sports and vice versa. If it goes 50-50, then you might be able to find a way to supplement the football and basketball budgets a little bit more. So there's a lot to go on here. Definitely something to watch there. Another thing that coaches in particular were not very happy about is the elimination of walk-ons. We did talk about this earlier in the week. It's one of those things that I fully understand where they're coming from, and I totally understand that roster construction and keeping everyone healthy and going through from spring practice to the starting day and through the season is not easy. There's no two ways about that. But the reality is, I just think it opens doors for more kids to go to group of 5 schools, to build up those schools a little bit more, and it makes it so I just think there's a little bit more of equity in these sports. I think you have a little bit more ability to bump down to smaller sports and give them a little bit more piece of the pie in that scenario. So I fully understand that it's not ideal for football, but I think it could be better for the other sports and for definitely the smaller schools in football for sure. So I think a lot of this stuff is going to be really, really fascinating to watch. One of the weirdest things that came out that doesn't have much to do with football, but does give you guys kind of an idea of what could happen in the future is some within the SEC are trying to get Duke basketball to come on over to the SEC and join them, but nothing else. They want just Duke basketball and the rest of the athletic department to go to another conference. That is a little crazy, if I'm being totally honest with you, because when you look at it, that sets a precedent where you can kind of just take pieces of the pie. Now, Notre Dame has done this for a little bit with basketball and the ACC, but the reality is this is a very interesting thing that could continue to happen. If you wanted to pick out the Florida State football program, if you wanted to pick out the Georgia football program, in all hypotheticals, of course, but it definitely does open a weird precedent if this were to happen, that you can kind of just take pieces of the pie without taking the entire thing, which is a very, very interesting concept, especially when you talk about conference realignment. So it'll be something to watch for sure. Definitely something that will be really, really fascinating. There was also belief that Clemson and Florida State will find their way out of the ACC. So there's a lot of confidence that they'll be out of the ACC. No one really knows where they'll go from there. Florida State doesn't seem to be very welcome in the SEC. Clemson the same. So I don't really know what's going on there. I don't know what Clemson is thinking right now. I'm not really sure what Florida State is thinking, but as of right now, it doesn't necessarily look great for those two schools, that's for sure. And also another piece, just kind of an added-on piece for conference realignment here, Utah to the ACC is definitely picking up steam. Utah is the only school that joined the Big Ten that did not sign their 99-year contract. So definitely something that we need to watch very, very closely. It could happen before this year. I would be a little bit surprised just because of the logistics of it all and everything that would have to happen for that to occur, but at the very least, it definitely could happen before 2025, and then who knows? A lot of different things can happen, especially around the ACC this time, so it'll be fascinating to watch all of this unfold. When you look at these SEC meetings, there's always fun details that come out. There's no two ways about that. There's always coaches talking on things that we really want to know about. There's always very, very interesting tidbits. And I think especially this year with Florida State, Clemson moving around, with the SEC kind of being in the center of that, with the House realignment, with Jaden Rashada, with all of the things to talk about, there were definitely a ton of things that came out of last week. And we'll definitely follow the Florida State and Clemson saga, I suppose, if you want to call it, for the next little bit, because that is going to be something that is going to be fascinating to watch. It's definitely something where Florida State feels like a team where they should be able to kind of decide which conference they go to and kind of just jump in and no problems, but it doesn't sound like it's going to be that way. So it's going to be really, really fascinating to watch that unfold. I think when you look at the landscape today, there's a lot of questions, and a lot of it revolves around what's the SEC going to do with the House settlement, what's the SEC going to do with conference realignment, and as well as the Big Ten. So when we look at these two conferences, we're really looking at college football as a whole, because they really define a lot of what goes on. So it's a fascinating thing to watch. I think when we look at these SEC meetings, they always have something, right? They always have some rumors. They always have something very interesting to unpack. And I think Florida State was definitely number one on my list. So it'll be fascinating to watch that unfold. I think we'll definitely keep you updated with all of the stuff happening over there. But we're going to take our first break here. And when we come back, we're going to talk about a question that's kind of been plaguing college football the last little bit, which is, what is good enough to make the playoff in the 12-team playoff? Who knows what's good enough? Is it 9-3? Is it 8-4? Is it 10-2? I have no idea, but let's try to figure that out right after this. So stick with us.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows with 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about some of the details from the SEC spring meetings this past week. Definitely a lot of stuff around conference realignment, around Florida State and Clemson, and a little bit of Utah in there as well. So definitely a lot of stuff to unpack there, but I do want to get to a question that has kind of been bouncing around the college football world the last couple of really years when we've heard about this 12-team playoff. What is good enough to make the playoff in 2024 in particular, but beyond in the 12-team playoff? I think when you look at some of the schedules that have kind of been unpacked, especially over the last, I feel like 5 years has really been the big-time moniker. You've seen a lot of big-time matchups pop into play. You've seen Texas, Michigan. You've seen Georgia, Clemson come into play. A&M's playing Notre Dame. A ton of big-time games have been scheduled by these big-time programs, and I think it's somewhat of a reaction to what they think is going to come from this new playoff that is definitely going to be a big-time question mark, I suppose, in the future of college football. I think when you look at these out-of-conference schedules, we talked about it yesterday with USC and LSU, it is vital that these games are a part of the early parts of these seasons. We absolutely need these teams on full display, playing some of the better teams in the country. Alabama playing Wisconsin is still a very fun game. A&M playing Notre Dame. We have Georgia playing Clemson. We have Texas playing Michigan. All of these games are hugely important to what college football is. It gets everyone excited for the season, gets everyone involved, gets everyone really, really pumped up, and it's something that I think all of us are very, very excited for when the season does come around. So when you add, those big time opponents, you definitely do open a little bit of a door for yourself, whether it's to be a 9-3 team that ends up getting into the playoff, where you can point to a Michigan game, let's say for Texas, and say we went out of our way to play a big time team. We shouldn't necessarily be punished as aggressively for that as someone who maybe is 11-1 but didn't necessarily play that aggressive of a schedule. So it's going to be a huge question mark, right? There's going to be so many things to kind of factor into that. Chris Del Conte talked about this at length when he was talking about Texas scheduling. He said they did this on purpose. They absolutely wanted more of those marquee games on the early parts of the season because it gives you a little bit more leeway one way or the other. Let's say Texas beats Michigan and they can use that as kind of a moniker where you can lose 2 games in the SEC and still point back to that as a really good win, the same way they did with Alabama a year ago. So I think this is something that is going to be fascinating to watch. Obviously, as we all know, the 5 top conference champions, they're in. So that's not necessarily a question. But 7 at-large teams is a lot. There's no two ways about that. There is a ton of at-large teams to play around with here. And the question is, where do they come from? I think we all can agree the vast majority will come from the Big Ten and the SEC in one form or another. But the reality is you got to include some other people, but you have to figure out how to include them. So I think one of the big questions that we'll likely see throughout this year is, say there's a Big 12 team. Let's say Iowa State. They're just a random team. But let's say Iowa State ends up going 11-1, but loses in the Big 12 championship. So they're not automatically in. They're 11-2. They're a really good team. They've done really good things and won a lot of their games. But then you also have a Texas or an Ole Miss, might be a good example here, that's 9-3 in the SEC. Now, obviously, Iowa State has 2 more wins. They have 1 less loss. They, got to their conference championship. But also, I think we can all say with confidence that Ole Miss is playing a much tougher schedule than Iowa State is. So you got to measure those two. You have to absolutely put those two next to each other and figure out which one is more important to you. Frankly, to me, I'm not a fan of auto bids. I think if the goal is to get a national title, if the goal is to get a national champ, it should always be the goal to put the best teams in that field. Now, I know there is a little bit of precarious situation that has happened in the past with the 4-team playoff, but honestly, I think it could be even more precarious as we go forward into this 12-team because this is going to happen. I can't necessarily, I know for a fact, in fact, the Florida State situation will never happen again. We're not going to have an undefeated team that gets left out of the playoff in favor of a one-loss team. That's just not going to happen because there's not going to be 13 undefeated teams in a season. But the reality is there are going to be teams that have more losses or have a worse record that find their way into the playoff. And frankly, I think it's a good thing. I think it's crazy to think, frankly, that we shouldn't be doing this. We have to find a way, especially in this 12-team playoff, to measure these schedules effectively. And I understand that will hurt some of the Big 12 and ACC teams in these arguments. But the reality is you're trying to find a national title. You're not necessarily trying to make sure everyone's included. And you've already done that by adding an auto bid for those leagues. So I don't necessarily worry about the at-large bids for those two for those two conferences and the other conferences that are a little bit below, because the reality is the best team should be playing at the end of the year for the biggest trophy. That's just the reality of the situation. I don't think there should be much of a pushback on that. I understand there are ACC fans, there are Big 12 fans that want their team to have a shot if they lose a couple of games, if they stumble a little bit. But the reality is when you stumble a little bit in the Big 12, it could be that you would have stumbled a lot in the SEC or the Big 10. So it's kind of one of those precarious situations. It's a question that is really going to be impossible to answer until you get to the end of the year, until you figure out what's going on with the college football playoff and with this season coming up. So it's going to be fascinating to watch. I think the SEC is kind of the one that probably poses the biggest threat here, because when you look at some of those big-time SEC schedules, they are terrifying. I could easily make the argument that a Florida team could go 9-3 and be comfortably a number 12 or top 12 team in the country. So there is definitely going to be a conversation here. There's definitely going to be a lot going into this. Now, one of the big things that someone over at CBS, I believe Shahan Jayaraja, broke down was what this hypothetical would look like in the past. So from 1998, let's say we had a 12-team playoff. There would be 28 teams with 3 losses or more that would have made the playoff in that 12 teams. So definitely a very interesting thing. As you can see, a lot from the SEC, a lot from the Big 12, which obviously, would include some teams that were in the past, like Texas, like Oklahoma. So that's a little bit of a different situation, but still, it definitely gives you an idea of where these would come from. Big 10 with 7, I think that might take a little bit of a boost and take away from some of what maybe the Pac-12 had during that time, and then the ACC with 4. So it gives you an idea that this isn't far-fetched necessarily. A 9-3 team getting in is absolutely something that could happen, and it's something that a lot of people at the SEC meetings were talking about, because you're going to play a tougher schedule. You're going to play games that every single week you have to show up and be ready to go, because you're going to get hit in the mouth a couple of times. So it's one of those things that I think when we look at the future of the 12-team playoff, it really rides on the shoulders of the selection committee. I think when you look at the selection committee, there is so much pressure on them to make sure that they get the right teams in, that they get the teams that absolutely deserve to be in, because when we look at this kind of era of college football, there is going to be a lot of variability. There's going to be a lot of question mark. There's going to be some upsets in some of these playoff games. But the reality is you have to put yourself in a position where at the end of the year we can look at the champion and say that is one of, if not the best team in the country. It's what we were able to do with most of the playoffs every playoff in the past, if I'm the one voting, frankly. But I think when we look at it, it's going to get more precarious, and it's going to get tougher to measure these guys next to each other. I frankly think we should be using some type of power rating system to figure out who should be in and who shouldn't, but that's, above my pay grade, I suppose. I think there's going to be a lot of fascinating things to happen from this. Let's say that a team that gets to their conference championship but doesn't play as tough of a schedule is rewarded for that. Let's just say a 11-2 Arizona beats out a 9-3 Ole Miss to get into the playoff. Those teams like Ole Miss, like Alabama, like Texas, like Michigan, Ohio State, Georgia, whoever you want to say, they're going to stop scheduling those big out-of-conference games. And they should, if I'm being totally honest. If the goal is to get into the playoff, if the goal is to put yourself in a position to get in the playoff, and you're not getting rewarded for scheduling those out-of-conference games that are going to be really tough, why would you do it? Why would you put yourself in that position to lose a game before you even get into your conference schedule, especially if you're a Big 12 or an SEC team where you're going to do plenty of big-time wins in your SEC or in your Big 10 schedule. So it's going to be fascinating to watch this unfold. I think when we look at the playoff this upcoming year, there are tons of teams that could find their way in. Obviously, tons of Group of 5 teams, but in the Big 12, I can think of 4 or 5 teams that I think could make a run and get a auto or at large bid. I think the ACC has 4 or 5 teams that could win the ACC or possibly get an at large bid, depending on how the cookie crumbles, as it were. But I do think there needs to be a real conversation in those rooms about what does an SEC schedule look like compared to an ACC, and how do we contextualize that? Because as we know, there are tougher schedules in those two conferences. That's just the way it is. They're going to play teams that are going to be higher rated most of the time when you go through those schedules. Now, that's not to say if you do go 11-1 in the Big 12 or the ACC, you shouldn't have a shot to get in, or you shouldn't get in necessarily, but you have to be able to measure these things accurately, and you have to be able to take out the part where, not necessarily take out the 3 losses and take out the 1 loss, but just look at it as holistically as possible and say this is a 9-3 season, but they played the number 4, 7, and 12 team in the country, whereas you have an 11-1 season where you played 2 ranked teams and they were number 18 and number 24. So there needs to be that conversation. There needs to be a push to get the best teams in, the teams that absolutely deserve to be in, the teams that have put themselves in the best position to be in, and it doesn't necessarily have to be completely tied to record as it kind of has been in the past. So this is going to be a fascinating thing to watch. I think it's one of those things that a lot of things are going to be decided about the future of college football and in terms of scheduling this year, because if you reward those teams for scheduling those out-of-conference games, I think more people will do it. If you dock them essentially for scheduling those games and possibly losing them, you're going to see more of what we saw yesterday with USC and LSU. I think there is a chance that some of these teams just decide, what's the point of us playing each other? If, let's just say, hypothetically, Texas goes 9-3, and one of those losses to Michigan, and they don't get in, and there's some controversy around that. Well, they play Ohio State next year, and why would you play Ohio State if that's going to put you in danger of not making the playoff again? So it's going to be fascinating to watch this unfold. I think it's one of those things where the College Football Playoff Committee has a lot of power in their hands about what the future of college football is going to look like from a scheduling perspective. So it'll be interesting to watch, that's for sure. But we're going to take our second break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about sponsorships possibly coming to college football on the field, on jerseys. Definitely a double-edged sword here, so I'll break that down right after this, so stick with us.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about a little bit of the 12-team playoff and what it would take kind of to get into the 12-team playoff. Definitely some different monikers for some different conferences, for some different teams, for some different schedules. So it's going to be fascinating to watch that unfold. Definitely a very interesting thing for the future of scheduling in college football. But let's start to get into some sponsorships possibly coming to college football. This is something that I think we all probably should have saw coming, right? The House versus NCAA case has just finished, and with it, a lot of bills have become on the paybook for a lot of different athletic departments around the country. So you got to find a way to make that money. You got to find a way to get that, to bridge that gap. We've heard about private equity possibly getting involved. I've said time and again, that's not necessarily my favorite way to go about things, because I think that sets a very dangerous precedent. I think it opens some doors that we do not want opened in college football. But it sounds like sponsorships might be one of the answers to this, and it's definitely a very interesting concept. So when we look at this at face value, I think there is a little bit of energy of, you hate it, right? It doesn't look good. You don't want, a big old All-State logo across the front of your jersey. Definitely not something that looks all that great, and definitely not something that I think a lot of us would love. But the reality is, when you look at the future of college sports and you look at what's going to happen with a lot of different teams and a lot of these different universities, you got to make the money, and you got to find a way to bridge the gap, and especially for the smaller sports. Scott Strickland was the one that spoke about this, the Florida athletic director, and he said, there's an obvious revenue stream that we have not had in the past, which is putting things on the field and putting things on jerseys, and it would make a lot of money. It makes, tens of millions of dollars for the NBA teams when they instituted it not only a couple of years ago, and it's definitely something that is super important to the future of the sport, because you got to make money. You have to make sure that not only college football, let's just put aside college football here for a second, there's going to be bills due for everyone, and there's going to be hard decisions that have to be made, and if you can make a little bit of money from sponsorships, or you can make a little bit of money here and there doing some different things, those questions become a little bit less dire. You are able to handle some of those smaller sports the way that we would all like them to be handled, where they get a little bit more respect, they get a little bit more money, they definitely keep moving. That's, I think, the biggest goal here is to make sure that we have all of these sports intact in the future, and this might be the best way to go about it. So it's obviously not necessarily something you'd love to see, but it might be something that we just have to do for college sports to stay the way that they are right now. Definitely something that's going to be really interesting. Another thing that Strickland brought up that I thought was fascinating was possibly bringing fantasy sports down to college football or college sports in general. It will be a fascinating thing if that were to happen. It's definitely something that builds a lot of interest in the NFL. I know people that don't really watch the NFL too much, but they love fantasy. So it's definitely something that would bring more eyes. It's definitely something that you can do now with a lot of the rules that are in place where players are allowed to kind of use their name, use their image, use their likeness to do not necessarily anything they want, but they can do a lot of different things. And fantasy would be, I think, a great way to go about it. It would get more fan interest. It would get a little bit more money in the pockets of the people that need it, these athletic departments right now. So definitely a double-edged sword, definitely something where you're a little bit worried, right? You don't want the traditional jerseys, the Penn States, the Alabamas, the Michigans to get ruined. You don't want the fields like Notre Dame, like the Big House, to be, slapped with a ton of different, sponsorships and a ton of different logos and make it, look a little bit less special. But the reality is this is kind of an interesting scenario where you don't have to do this by any means. It's definitely would be up to the school if they want to add these sponsorships to their logo. Now, obviously, you don't necessarily want to give up $10 million to someone who is doing it, but if you are Notre Dame, if you are Michigan, and you want to keep that pristine feel to your football stadium, you can do that pretty easily, and you can just say, no to this extra little bit of money, and as we've learned throughout this time, those schools don't necessarily need that extra money. Alabama's athletic director, Greg Byrne, talked about this, and he basically said he's going to be open-minded in the future, but doesn't necessarily see that being a thing they do, especially the jersey patches. You don't want to ruin those jerseys. They're as iconic as it gets in this sport. Penn State the same, Michigan the exact same. So I fully understand that this is going to be something that a lot of people are a little bit upset about, a lot of people don't like because, in other sports when it's happened, the NBA ones are a little bit rough to look at. I'll be totally honest with you. I don't love soccer jerseys having the big old one across the chest, but the reality is it does bring in a lot of money for them, and it helps some of the things in the back end look a little bit better. And right now, college sports needs as much help as it can get, making sure that everything is in order. Everything is perfectly the way it should be, and move forward with as many sports, all of the sports, if you can. And the only way to do that is with money. The only way to do that is to find these type of solutions, the sponsorships, possible private equity, even though I don't love it by any means. There's going to be answers that we probably don't love. But the reality is the money's got to come from somewhere to make sure that the softball team can play and to make sure that the swimming team is still intact 5 years from now. And also to make sure that a lot of this stuff stays under the roof of the school, because there are talks about some of these going away from the school a little bit and maybe carrying the name but not being as attached to the school as it has been in the past. I think if you influx a little bit of more money into this, it makes it more worth the while of these teams to stay intact. So it's one of those things where you take one step backwards in terms of maybe the jerseys don't look as cool, maybe the stadiums don't have quite the same feel, but you might be able to take a couple of steps forward when it comes to college sports where you can keep the softball team, you can keep the swimming team, you can keep the golf team, all of the teams that right now are probably biting their nails and worried about what the future looks like. This would subside some of those worries, and it's something that is hugely important to the future of college sports overall. So maybe this will hurt college football just a little bit. Maybe this is something that will definitely ruin a couple of really iconic jerseys, definitely throw a little bit of a wrench into some stadiums that we have gotten used to the way they look. But the reality is, when you look at the state of college sports right now, there's a lot of costs and there's not enough money to go around for a lot of these universities. So let's say your UCLA, we talked about them being in a little bit of a precarious situation with their athletic budget, and they can use this. And if they do use this, then they can possibly bridge some of those gaps that they have in their athletic budget and definitely subside some of the worries, at least, for at the very least, for some of these fans and some of these players. So it's one of those things where you don't necessarily love it, and I totally get that, and it's definitely something that I prefer if it didn't happen, if I'm being totally honest with you. But as long as the school has the choice, as long as it's something that is not, pushed on people, and especially as long as it keeps these college sports in the building and in the athletic department and running as real sports with scholarships, with all of these benefits these athletes get today, I'm all good. I have very little problem with that. I understand why people are going to have problems with this and why people will likely be a little bit more upset than they likely should be. But the reality is we're in a new era of college football. We're in a new era of college sports. And with that comes a little bit more money and a little bit more of finding that money in places where we might not love it. And frankly, if this is the alternative to private equity, sign me up 10 times out of 10, because I do not necessarily want an outside group being involved in any decision making that goes on in an athletic department. I'll be totally honest with you. I don't want anyone that their sole goal is to make a lot of money inside college athletics. Now, sponsorships would, bring that into the fray, but it wouldn't bring the actual company in those decision makings for the future of college football. It would just put a little bit more money in those athletic departments' pockets, while maybe, altering the field just a little bit or altering the jersey just a little bit. So it's going to be one of those things where I can only imagine that people are going to be upset. I can only imagine that people are going to, throw their hands up and say this is the death of college football and everything is changing and we're done, we're dead in the water. But the reality is this is a very benign change for what the future of college football could have been, where maybe you don't do this and then you run into money problems and some sports start to get cut off and there's some very, very sketchy dealings in the future of college sports in general. So this is one of those things. It's a small loss for college football maybe, but it's a huge win for college sports in sense of just having the money to deal with all of this stuff that's coming down the pipe. So it's going to be one of those fascinating things to watch. Definitely will be something that I'm sure people on Twitter are blowing up about in the next couple of days, but I promise it's not that big a deal. And I promise if you really want your team not to do it, email your athletic director and try to convince him not to do it. So it'll be fascinating to watch that unfold. Definitely some interesting matchups that could happen between sponsorships and schools. Definitely will be a fun thing to watch, but we'll definitely break that down as it comes. But we're going to take our third break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about some of the scheduling updates. Some big-time changes have happened to some big-time rivalries in this game, so I definitely want to break that down, as well as some other just smaller games that definitely will have a lot to do with this upcoming college football season. So stick around, and we will break that down right after this.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about possible sponsorships entering college football and college sports overall. Definitely something that, you wouldn't love to see, but it's the reality of college sports. You got to find that money somewhere. Definitely something that is going to be interesting to watch. But let's talk about some of the different scheduling details that have come out. We have gotten tons of new game times, tons of different, maybe some mix-up to some game times that you didn't expect, and definitely a lot of things to break down with this. So this likely will not get to all of the bases, definitely a ton of things to cover from yesterday, but let's just give you guys an idea of where we're sitting right now and kind of how all of this is looking going into this season. So one of the biggest things, I think probably the biggest thing that came out yesterday is Texas-Oklahoma. The Red River rivalry will be at 3:30. It will be in that prime SEC slot at 3:30 on ESPN this time around, as CBS is moving on to the Big Ten. Definitely a devastating turn of events there, but the reality is this is a very, very interesting thing. I mean, I, for the longest time, remember this thing being played on noon, at noon. It wasn't played at noon in 2017, I remember, but other than that, that's as I remember it, if I'm being totally honest with you. So definitely a very big shift, but I think when you look at it at face value, this is something that was pretty much always going to happen. You look at these two programs, two historic programs, two blue bloods entering the SEC. you want to highlight them as much as possible. You want to give them as much shine as possible, and this is the game that a lot of SEC fans need to be introduced to, because I've said it on here before, I think it's the best rivalry in all of college football. I'm not going to say it's, better than some of the SEC ones in terms of the SEC ramifications, but the reality is this game is unlike any other. You have a ton of people out at the state fair that just walk right in, and then they're a little bit too drunk probably, but the reality is it is a ton of fun. There are fans split down the 50, which does not happen really anywhere else in college football. There's so much going into this, and definitely going to be fascinating to watch. Now, one of the things I will say is a 3:30 kick in Dallas in that time of year is a dangerous game. There will be plenty of EMTs on site, I hope, and it will be hot, and there will be people that definitely didn't drink a lot of water that morning, I'll put it that way, but it'll be a fascinating thing to watch. I've seen kind of a mixed reaction from both fan bases. Some absolutely love it and have been begging for this. Some don't love it and absolutely hate this. So definitely something that will be really interesting to watch. For me, I don't much care, if I'm being totally honest with you. They could play this game at 3 a.m. on 480p and I would be watching it. So I don't know. It's one of those things that I could get upset about it. I could be mad that it's moving back 3.5 hours, but it's all the same to me. I'm still going to watch this game very closely, still going to love it, and it's still going to be one of the best games that we see all year. So I definitely am not necessarily as beaten up about this as some others. One other interesting thing that happened, Ole Miss and Mississippi State are moving over to Black Friday. They're going to play 3:30 on that day. Definitely a very interesting move. They were the Thanksgiving game. They were the game where you'd either finish up Thanksgiving dinner or you get your second plate after a little early Thanksgiving dinner, and you sit down and you watch the Egg Bowl, and it's one of the very, very fun traditions, and taking that away makes me a little bit sad. I'll be totally honest with you. This was a game that I love to watch every Thanksgiving. That being said, when you're competing with the NFL, especially that night game, it gets a little bit tough. And so I totally understand this move. I think it's something that will probably increase the viewership on this game, and it absolutely should be a game that we look at very closely because it deserves a lot of love. It is a fascinating game that is so interesting, that is definitely something that I really want to watch very, very closely. So don't necessarily hate it. I do wish we had something on Thanksgiving. I know that Texas A&M used to play on that day. It sounds like Trev Alberts, the new A&M AD, is not necessarily too keen on that idea of moving it back to Thanksgiving, but it sounds like Texas is very keen on that idea. So we'll see what happens there. We'll see if the SEC wants to move it there or does not. Right now it's scheduled on that Saturday, and I think it'll stay there at least for this year, but we'll see what happens in the future for that one. I think one of the other big-time changes was another rivalry. We kind of got some big-time news around those. Clean old-fashioned hate, Georgia Tech against Georgia, has moved back to Black Friday. They're going to play right after the Egg Bowl at 7:30 p.m. Eastern. All of these times are Eastern, by the way. So this is definitely going to be a very interesting change. I remember this game being at noon on Saturday for pretty much my entire life. I've been to a ton of these games. Definitely a very, very interesting thing. This is the first time Georgia has played Georgia Tech on a Friday since 1994. And the last non-Saturday game that will be played in Athens since, I believe, that game, if I'm being totally honest. Oh, excuse me, no, since 1995. I was reading that wrong. But the Bulldogs played Georgia Tech on Thanksgiving Day in 1995. So that would be the last time that Georgia played any game in Sanford Stadium that was not on a Saturday. So a very, very interesting dynamic there. This is a game that, for me, I'd love to have it on Rivalry Saturday, but it also gets kind of lost in the shuffle when you're up against the Michigan-Ohio State game, and especially when Georgia Tech has kind of been tapering off a little bit, and that game has become a little bit more lopsided than it has been in the past. Obviously, last year was not that way, but definitely has been a little bit more lopsided in recent years. It's going to get a little bit overshadowed. Now, moving it back to a Friday night where a lot of people don't have a ton going on, maybe you have family in town, maybe you're just still working over that Thanksgiving hangover, whatever it looks like, you can definitely watch this game, and it's a fantastic game. It's one of my favorite games in college football, mostly because I grew up watching it very closely, but it's definitely one of those games that I think deserves a little bit more love, deserves a little bit more shine, and putting it on its own day will definitely do that. So very, very excited about that. I think that's one of the moves that I'm not too broken up about by any means. You have Penn State at West Virginia. That's the opening week. They're going to be at noon. Definitely getting my schedule ready for that opening week, definitely getting the TVs, got to figure out which is going where and when, and how I'm going to kind of channel surf on these days. So definitely going to be a huge game there. I think that's a very fascinating one between two teams that could make some noise in their conferences, but if they're going to do it, they likely have to win this game. So it's going to be really interesting to watch that. We had Arkansas and Oklahoma State. They're going to be at noon the following week. So definitely some great matchups these first couple of weeks. Definitely a lot to watch these first couple of weeks. I think this Arkansas-Oklahoma State game is going to be a great moniker for what Oklahoma State can be this year. Arkansas is a great team. I think they're going to be a team that in the next couple of years kind of starts to build up. But the reality is right now, Oklahoma State should win that game. And if they don't win that game, they might be in a little bit of trouble in their Big 12 and possibly playoff hunt this upcoming year. So that'll be a fascinating one to watch. We also got a doubleheader on CBS with Notre Dame at Purdue, then Colorado versus Colorado State. Now, if we get a repeat of what we got last year from Colorado State, I think we're going to have plenty of fun. There's no two ways about that. I think that's going to be an incredible matchup. If Notre Dame has lost by then, they play A&M to open the season. They are not a favorite right now. So say they lose that game, the Purdue game becomes that much more important. Not necessarily, the toughest opponent in the world, but going to their place, playing a team that I think is building up under Ryan Walters is not necessarily what you want to be in, especially with one loss already on the schedule. So definitely a game to watch there. Definitely a ton of things that went on yesterday with a ton of different game times and possible movements and everything in between that came out yesterday. And it'll be a fascinating thing to watch. I think when you look at a lot of these games and you look at kind of how important they are, you don't want them to move necessarily. You don't want Texas and OU to be moving a little bit later in the day, partly because of the tradition, partly because I worry for the health of some of the people that are around Dallas that day. But also, you don't want, Georgia Tech and Georgia moving off that Saturday. But all of this stuff feels relatively benign to me. And it feels like, especially for the Egg Bowl and for Georgia Tech and Georgia, it gives them even bigger of a shine. And they definitely should get that. I think the Egg Bowl is one of the most unique and fascinating matchups that we get every single year. I think Georgia Tech and Georgia is one of those where, honestly, in the past, you've been able to kind of throw out the record books. Obviously, Georgia has kind of dominated in some years, but there have been a couple of years where Tech plays them really close like they did a year ago, or they win the game like they did in 2016 and 2014, and do some things that people aren't expecting them to do. So I have no problem with those games getting a little bit more shine than they already do. I have no problem with them moving a little bit to get that shine. So definitely not necessarily the tradition aspect that we all love about this sport, but the reality is, as long as the football's on, as long as it, is standalone and I can watch it, I don't really have much of an issue. It's definitely not necessarily something I would love to happen, I suppose, but the reality is getting more shine on some of these games like the Egg Bowl, like clean old-fashioned hate, that's the good thing for college football, and definitely something that I am very excited about. So it'll be interesting to watch all of this stuff. It definitely didn't even scratch the surface of all of the stuff that came out yesterday, so definitely check in on all of the things, especially your team, where they're going to be playing. But we'll take our last break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about College Football 25. A ton of updates came out after all of the media guys went down to Orlando and finally were able to speak on it a little bit. So we'll break that down right after this, so stick with us. Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about some of the scheduling updates that came out for the opening weeks, for some of the later weeks with some of the rivalries that got mixed up a little bit, but definitely going to be a very interesting thing to watch with some of these places in new spots for this upcoming year. But let's get into college football 25 and let's talk about all of the things that are going on, especially today. We are getting some gameplay today. There is going to be a walkthrough probably right about an hour from now, I think at 10:55 Eastern Time, where we will see a lot of the details of this game. Now, I wish that it was coming out before our show started, but that's the reality we live in with this 9 a.m. Start over here. So definitely going to be a very interesting thing to watch. I think we've gotten a ton of details already, though, and 90% of them are awesome. Now there's ers and ahs there that I do not love, and we'll start with those just to get those out of the way. First of all, the biggest thing is Road to Glory will not start in high school. That is something that I don't understand. That is something that I very much hope that they fix in the future, because I'm not so interested in playing Road to Glory anymore. I'll be totally honest with you. I loved the high school tournament. I loved playing those games, and definitely made it a lot more fun going through the recruitment, going through all of the stuff that gave that mode a lot of special moments. So definitely something that doesn't make me very happy, and I hope that they kind of fix going forward. But it's also, I'm going to be focused on Dynasty for the most part anyway, if I'm being totally honest with you. So not the worst thing in the world, but they definitely do have to fix that going forward if I'm the one voting, at least. Another not so bad thing, but not great thing by any means, is a couple of the big time songs that define college football will not be in the game. Enter Sandman, Jump Around will not be in the game, which is obviously not what we want at all, but some people just ask for too much money. That's just the reality of the situation. Some people should ask for a lot of money for these songs, so not necessarily the worst thing in the world. Definitely will be something that'll be fascinating to watch, but that's kind of it for the bad stuff. I'll be totally honest with you. There have been tons of leaks, but I don't really know if they're real or not. There's tons of people trying to create their own type of leaks just to get a little bit of likes on Twitter, so I don't necessarily want to give a ton of credence to that. But there were tons of other updates. There were tons of things that came out that I definitely want to get to, and we talked about Road to Glory. We talked about missing the songs, but one of the biggest things I want to highlight here is Jacksonville State, App State, Sam Houston State, Liberty, Kennesaw State, Coastal Carolina, James Madison, Georgia Southern, and Charlotte. All of those guys are in the game for the very, very first time. So absolutely huge shout out to those teams. Very, very cool for all of those kids. And definitely something that I might just pick one of these teams to take on a little bit of a run. James Madison is one that I'm watching very closely as I get closer and closer to making that decision. But I think it's going to be fascinating to watch all of this. Number one on my list for good news when we're coming out of this week where we've had a lot of different murmurs and stuff, not one person that has played this game, that has been involved with this game, has said that it is a Madden reskin. No one has said that it is like Madden. Everyone has said it is more detailed, it is more intense, it is better in every way than what Madden has right now. So that is absolutely fantastic news. Definitely something that people were pretty worried about going into this next going into this game, where EA in the past, let's be totally honest, has kind of done that, where it's pretty much the same Madden game over and over. It's pretty much the same FIFA game over and over. So that's definitely something that people were worried about. It sounds like that's not going to be a problem, which is absolutely huge. There are 134 playbooks, 10 different offensive styles, so I'll have to figure out which one I want to use. Definitely going to be a hard decision there. There's also capabilities for some players, and they grow as they get further on in their career. Senior quarterbacks will play better for the majority of the time than freshman quarterbacks, especially reading possible blitzes, reading different coverages, doing some of the things that seniors are better than freshmen at. So definitely going to be a fascinating thing to watch there. Custom conferences are back, so you can kind of play around with that. You can put 20 teams in one conference. You can put, no teams or maybe 2 teams in one conference like the Pac-12 right now. But for me, I think I'm going to go back to the Southwest Conference days, or at least back to the early Big 12 days where you had Missouri, you had Nebraska, you had Colorado, all the teams that make sense in the Big 12. Let's put it that way. But I think this is going to be an incredible game. It feels like we keep getting closer and closer, and every little detail I hear makes me more excited. It feels like it's going to be very detailed. It's going to be one of those games where you better be locked in, because you can't just, press a button and throw a deep ball to one of the best players and get a glitch and score a touchdown. you're going to have to do a lot of things that you didn't have to do in past games. You're going to have to worry about wear and tear, which apparently is a real part of this game that is going to be a big factor for teams. You have to, figure out what offensive style you want to run, figure out how you want to go about business, and it feels like a lot of this stuff is going to be very, very specific. So absolutely love that. It sounds like the players have specific attributes and abilities based on, what they can do on the football field. So maybe Carson Beck's is really good accuracy, and that's something you can kind of unlock throughout time. Maybe Jalen Milroe's ability is elite speed or escape ability, whatever it looks like. It's going to be really remarkable to watch. And then Dynasty is one of the biggest things that I think people are going to be playing in this game, including myself. You can go 30 seasons deep in these Dynasty seasons. I think I'm definitely going to play at least one that goes 30 seasons. I'll put it that way. But you can also have 32 guys, whether they're online or offline. You can play 32 different people on these Dynasty modes. So definitely would be a very, very cool thing to do with all your friends if you got 32 friends to spare that are all on the same console, because it doesn't sound like they're going to have a cross-play between the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox or anything like that. So that's something that I very much hope gets fixed. I definitely will have a very, very long run with one coach. I got to figure out what that name will be. So if you got any coaching names, definitely give me a little bit of suggestions. I'm going to go kind of the Coach Doug's route by Big Cat over there at Barstool. So definitely something that I'm very much looking forward to. Maybe I'll do a little bit of a preview on these shows by maybe like a selection, like a recruitment for these for the upcoming game. But the Dynasty coach, you have to decide whether you want to be a motivator, a recruiter, or a tactician. All of those things obviously super important, but you got to pick which one you want to build around. If you were to ask me, I would lean tactician, but that's beside the point. You can pick whichever one you want. Obviously, you're going to need to be able to recruit. You're going to need to be able to motivate. So it's going to be a fascinating thing to watch. The same thing happens with coordinators when you hire them. So you got to build out your staff the way you want it to be. And then recruiting is going to be a fascinating thing to watch. Each class will have 4,000 prospects, including athletes, which were very, very, I think are back in the game, honestly. But you can't create a prospect, so you can't just make, an absolutely crazy athlete that can do everything on the football field and just put him in your game anymore. So definitely, I guess a little bit of a takeaway, if you can say, but it'll be fascinating to watch. You can sign up to 35 players in any class. You can have a roster up to 85 scholarship guys. So you kind of have to work around that. You can encourage guys to go into the transfer portal, which is essentially just cutting them because they essentially cannot decline it. So all of this stuff is just so much detail. And to me, it's really cool. To me, it makes all of this stuff more, intensive and more, you can connect with it more and be more involved. And I think that's always a great thing. Also, in recruiting, you have some pipelines. As we know, let's just take Georgia as a great example. They do incredible work in Florida and incredible work in California, getting some guys. That's the same thing in this game. You're going to have some pipelines, and also some recruits are going to have some deal breakers that you just cannot have in your program or in the conversations with them, that you're going to just lose them outright. So it's going to be very fascinating to watch. I think there's definitely going to be a lot of really interesting things that come out of this game. Definitely a lot of detail, definitely a lot of stuff. Also, one of the big time things that frankly I'm excited about, and I think a lot of you might be as well, NIL is not going to exist in Dynasty mode. So you'll have brand exposure, you'll have TV exposure, whatever. You'll have different things involved in it, but NIL as it is today in college football will not be in, and I very much hope that's the case going forward, because I don't really want to wrap my head around that. I'll be totally honest with you. If it's a headache for Nick Saban and for Kirby Smart in the real world, which is much tougher than a video game, I am not the mentally tough guy that Nick Saban or Kirby Smart is, at least not to that degree. So it's going to be a headache for me too. So I'm not necessarily too upset about that by any means. I do think this is going to be one of those games where I think everyone around the country that is a college football fan is as excited as you can be. This is probably the game that they've looked forward to for the last 11 years, myself included. So as more details come out, the more excited I get, the more into it I get, the more involved I get, and it feels like this game is going to be incredible. I don't want to, jinx myself. I don't want to get too ahead of myself, but I'm very excited for the gameplay to come out here in about an hour. I'm definitely going to be watching it right away, and we'll probably break it down on Monday, to be totally honest with you. So this game keeps getting closer, and as it gets closer, I keep getting more and more confident that this is going to be a game that I'm going to love, that everyone's going to love. So cannot wait. It's going to be really special, and once July 16th rolls around, I'm going to be playing that pretty much 24/7 for sure. But that'll do it for this edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Your support means a lot to us, so please remember to subscribe to the show, leave a positive review. It does make a huge difference. Also, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, all of the social pages for all of the content and updates you could possibly need. We have tons of people doing pretty incredible work around every single sport you could want, whether it's wrestling, women's sports, golf, hockey, whatever it is. We have you covered at GSMC Sports, so come on over and take it all in. But thank you once again for listening, and I will see you guys tomorrow.
Let's go.